December 4, 1941. The Imperial Japanese Navy courier ship Nagara Maru cut through grey Pacific waters under a low ceiling of rain. In its locked steel safes, bundles of silk-bound codebooks were guarded with more devotion than gold. On the docks of Yokohama, an American naval attaché recorded in his log that courier bags were carried with a ceremonial air, never left unattended, not even for a breath of smoke. That note, tucked into the Naval Intelligence Division's file for the month, is one of the rare glimpses into a world where paper and syllables weighed as heavily as torpedoes. What was the weakness of this fortress of secrecy? It came not from broken locks or captured ships, but from a single weather word. One seemingly innocent phrase transmitted over open radio, repeated by Japanese forecasters without thought. That single word became the keyhole through which Allied codebreakers pried open the Empire's most guarded communications. But before Pearl Harbor erupted, before the Pacific skies burned with Zero fighters, the story of how Allied cryptanalysts turned couriers into liabilities and weather reports into weapons had already begun. Tokyo Station, July 22, 1940. The sweltering heat shimmered across the steel rails as a small procession advanced through the concourse. At its center walked two men in immaculate dark suits, their white gloves clasped firmly around leather satchels sealed with red wax. A reporter for the Asahi Shimbun that morning described the atmosphere as both ceremonial and unyielding, and with reason. These were no ordinary diplomatic pouches. Inside were the ciphers, tables, and directives of the Imperial Japanese Navy, documents that could steer fleets and shape wars. Allies later pieced together fragments of that moment from surveillance logs. A U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence memo dated September 12, 1940, noted that courier bags remain under continuous guard, even during meals, and are never left in consular offices overnight. It was less an observation of routine than a warning. The Empire had built a fortress of secrecy, brick by brick, satchel by satchel. Imagine the scene more closely. Passengers in linen suits fanned themselves with paper handbills advertising Mitsukoshi department store sales, while just yards away, two armed guards accompanied the couriers aboard the Tokaido Line Express, bound for Yokohama. Ordinary Tokyoites carried bento boxes filled with rice and pickled plums, while these men carried documents whose ink, if deciphered, could alter naval movements across the Pacific. Why did the Japanese place such faith in human couriers when faster, more modern methods already existed? The answer lay partly in experience. Telegraph lines had been tapped in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, and by 1939, the Japanese Foreign Ministry believed physical control was the only safeguard. Leather, wax, and steel locks were considered less fallible than wires or waves, but in their devotion to ritual, they overlooked a paradox. The more visible the courier, the easier he was to track. Already, Allied intelligence officers were noting the patterns. In Washington, analysts compared Japanese courier ship schedules with port records. One entry at Pearl Harbor's Harbor Master Office in March 1940 recorded a courier transfer onto the Taiyo Maru, destination San Francisco. The officer's handwriting underlined the detail. Transferred with ceremony. Trunk-shaped bag carried by two men. A half-eaten apple lay on the dock after the shift change, an ordinary trace of labor, but next to it a reminder that extraordinary secrets were being moved in plain sight. Curiosity rises here. If couriers were guarded so fiercely, could they ever be intercepted? The Allies debated this quietly. Should they risk seizing the bags, violating diplomatic convention and tipping off Tokyo? Or should they watch silently, waiting for a crack? The International Committee of the Red Cross, bound by treaty, insisted that diplomatic pouches were inviolable. But for men at Bletchley Park and Arlington Hall, every sealed satchel represented a frustration, knowledge traveling by train and ship, just beyond their reach. A Japanese diplomat later recalled in his memoir that the bag was like a second heart. We carried it against our chest, and we never let it leave our sight. That testimony, decades later, underscores the near-religious devotion couriers felt. Yet devotion could not conceal the reality that war was approaching. By mid-1940, Japan had joined the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy. Every courier who stepped aboard a train in Tokyo was part of a larger tide pulling the nation toward confrontation. The contrast outside the station was striking. Newsboys shouted headlines about baseball matches and summer festivals, while inside, men with white gloves moved satchels, whose contents would help ignite the Pacific. War. That split reality, the abundance of daily life against the shadows of war, was a hallmark of the months before Pearl Harbor. But what neither the couriers nor the crowds could have guessed was that their ritual of secrecy was already under scrutiny. To Allied observers, the key to Japan's codes might not lie in the bags themselves, but in something far less obvious. The airwaves above them, filled with routine words about rain and wind. Yokohama Harbor, September 5, 1940. The evening tide pushed against the hull of the Taiyo Maru as uniformed port officials checked manifests under flickering lanterns. Among the trunks of passengers and crates marked with kanji for silk and tea, 2 locked satchels stood out. They were handed directly from station guards to the ship's purser, under the watchful eyes of diplomats. A harbor logbook, preserved in the Yokohama Municipal Archives, confirms special courier pouches transferred to purser's office, sealed and guarded until departure. Across the Pacific, the United States Navy was already watching. An Office of Naval Intelligence file, dated October 2, 1940, tracked the Taiyo Maru's course, noting its expected arrival in San Francisco within 19 days. The memo contained no intercepts, no cracked codes, only a simple observation. The same ship carried Japanese consular staff and 2 safes of diplomatic material. It was a tantalizing line for men who knew those safes held instructions. Naval rosters, perhaps even cipher tables. Picture the voyage. Passengers on deck sipped green tea from thermoses, marveling at the vastness of the Pacific. Meanwhile, deep below in the purser's cabin, the courier satchels rested in a steel compartment, sealed with wax, the keys kept on a chain around an officer's neck. The ritual of custody was absolute. Guards rotated every 4 hours, their logs signed with a brushstroke flourish. Yet even this perfection of procedure revealed its weakness. Every time a courier stepped on deck, every port call, every dock worker who glimpsed the satchels left a trail for Allied intelligence. In San Francisco, U.S. customs men were under strict orders not to touch the bags. Diplomatic immunity shielded them, an invisible armor stronger than steel, and yet surveillance tightened around the edges. Hotel clerks noted which rooms Japanese envoys rented. Western Union operators reported which telegrams were sent after a courier's arrival. One FBI field report from November 1940 bluntly observed, "Wherever the satchel goes, cables soon follow." Here lies the contrast. Ordinary Japanese immigrants in California were fighting eviction notices, reading the San Francisco Chronicle for baseball box scores, while their government's couriers carried codebooks across the same streets, untouched, untouchable. American society could debate its politics openly, criticize Roosevelt on the radio. Yet these men in tailored suits slipped through immune from scrutiny. The paradox infuriated some in naval intelligence, who argued interception was worth the diplomatic cost. Others warned, one wrong move and Japan would know its couriers were compromised. A British inspector in Singapore, later writing in a 1946 debrief, remembered the anxiety of those months. The pouches seemed to carry not just documents, but the shadow of war itself. That sentence echoes the tension of the moment. Every sealed bag became both a shield and a provocation, a symbol of Japan's determination to control its secrets. But secrecy carries weight, and weight slows movement. By late 1940, the Allies began mapping courier routes not only across oceans but across continents, Lisbon to Berlin, Tokyo to Manila. The irony was bitter. The Japanese believed the satchels invisible, yet their very rigidity made them predictable. A courier boarding a train in Tokyo was almost certain to appear weeks later at a consulate in San Francisco. Predictability is oxygen for intelligence, and still the Allies held their hands. They did not seize the bags. They did not cut the wax seals. Instead, they waited, watching the couriers sail past them with the certainty of ritual. What they sought was subtler, a chink not in the leather or the lock, but in the assumptions of the men who carried them. That chink would not come from the bags themselves. It would arrive from elsewhere, borne invisibly on the very air that filled the courier's sails. The weather reports transmitted by Japanese radio, routine words that seemed harmless, yet would soon become the Allies' pry bar into the Empire's guarded secrets. Bletchley Park, June 18, 1941. The rain had not stopped since dawn. Inside Hut 7, the air smelled of ink, damp wool, and the faint hum of shortwave receivers. Rows of clerks leaned over lined logbooks, pencils scratching in rhythm with the bursts of static. On the paper, their neat script captured the plainest of phrases. Tokyo radio, 18 set hours, northeast winds, light showers. To a casual ear, it was nothing more than meteorology, the chatter of weathermen. To the government code and cipher school, it was potential gold. A log entry preserved in the UK National Archives records that day exactly. Traffic consistent, hourly identical format, correlated with naval cipher groups. Across the Atlantic at Arlington Hall, Virginia, the U.S. Army Signal Intelligence Service had built a similar routine. In a November 1941 bulletin titled Weather Key, officers outlined how Japanese forecasters used set language, repeating words for rain, cloud, and direction. What seemed harmless repetition could act as a crib, a predictable string of letters inside an otherwise unbreakable cipher. One officer scribbled a note in the margin, "Weather phrases provide skeletons for attack." That margin note, insignificant at the time, became a fulcrum for breaking Japanese codes. Picture the contrast. In Tokyo, forecasters read reports over Radio Tokyo as casually as announcing the date of a festival, their words drifting into the night sky. In Britain and America, men and women hunched over radios turned those same words into threads that could unravel fleets. A phrase like east wind rain might sound poetic to the public. To codebreakers, it was the lever to pry open naval orders, convoy schedules, even the timing of attacks. Every log mattered. Operators tracked the time down to the second, marking when a transmission began, when static cut in, when it ended. In Bletchley, a junior clerk remembered in her memoir that the weathermen gave us the kindness of repetition. The skies over Tokyo were our best teachers. Her line captures the strange intimacy of the work, knowing men thousands of miles away by the cadence of their weather reports. Retention hook. Could something as ordinary as a weather word truly swing the balance of war? Consider this. While a courier carried a sealed satchel across the Pacific in 20 days, a weather phrase carried by radio reached Britain in under 2 minutes. Speed became the Allies' hidden weapon, and yet secrecy demanded patience. These broadcasts did not immediately yield maps or orders. They offered fragments, bones without flesh. Analysts compared weather phrases with intercepted naval ciphers, looking for alignments. When a cipher repeated a weather word, they could strip it bare letter by letter until a crack appeared. It was exhausting work, measured not in victories but in inches. A single clear-text word, rain, fog, east, could unlock 1,000 jumbled characters of encrypted command. Outside the huts, Britain lived another rhythm. Londoners read the Daily Express over breakfast, complaining about sugar rations and the price of coal, while inside Bletchley huts, clerks plotted rainfall over Honshu. The contrast was surreal. Domestic shortages on one side, imperial war traffic on the other. But slowly, certainty grew. By mid-1941, Allied codebreakers realized that Japanese reliance on couriers was not a closed fortress at all. It was a crutch. The very reason couriers existed was that their radio traffic seemed vulnerable. Yet, by overlooking weather chatter, the Japanese had left a side door open. They had protected their satchels with guards and wax, but the air above them flowed unguarded, carrying secrets to anyone patient enough to listen. Cheltenham, England, December 3, 1941. In the small wooden hut of the British WWII service station, a corporal in headphones scribbled down the words drifting through static, Higashi no kaze-ami, east wind, rain. The phrase was simple, almost pastoral. But within Allied listening posts, those 3 words carried the weight of dread. A War Department alert bulletin issued that very morning in Washington had warned, Japanese broadcasts may carry a weather phrase as signal of rupture. When the corporal underlined the phrase twice in his log, he knew he might have just heard the trigger for war. The order had been crafted weeks earlier in Tokyo. Foreign Minister Togo had directed embassies that should diplomatic relations collapse, coded weather signals would be broadcast to alert consulates abroad. East wind, rain for war with the United States. West wind, clear for Britain. North wind cloudy for the Soviet Union. It was language weaponized. Forecast turned into thunderclap. At Fort Hunt, Virginia, American monitoring teams strained their receivers toward Tokyo. They listened day and night for the telltale phrase. In an entry preserved in Signal Intelligence Service logs, an officer noted on December 4th, static severe, frequency unstable, searched for east wind rain, nothing positive. Anxiety mounted. What if the signal had already been sent and missed? What if war had been declared silently, by a phrase disguised as weather? Retention hook. Imagine the tension. Across America, families read the New York Times over morning coffee, debating baseball scores and ration rumors. Yet in the basement of Arlington Hall, young women in headphones gripped their pencils, knowing a single Japanese word could determine whether fleets were already on the move across the Pacific. One clerk later recalled, "Every rainstorm felt like an omen. The contrast was staggering." While Japanese couriers still guarded leather satchels on ships and trains, their homeland had already instructed the skies themselves to deliver the message of war. The Allies had feared wax and locks. Now they feared wind and rain. Bletchley's internal memos grew frantic. On December 5th, an officer wrote, "We are uncertain whether signal was sent, but we must assume imminence of hostilities." That assumption pushed war readiness to its highest pitch. Battleships at Pearl Harbor raised their alert levels slightly, though not enough to brace for the storm about to arrive. And then, the silence. No one was sure if east wind rain had been definitively broadcast. Cheltenham's corporal thought he heard it. Fort Hunt officers thought perhaps not. The ambiguity itself became the weapon. The Japanese had crafted a code that, once rumored, could terrify even if unheard. By the time the sun rose over Oahu on December 7th, it no longer mattered. The code phrase had fulfilled its purpose: suspicion, dread, and paralysis. A Japanese naval officer later admitted in a 1946 interrogation, "The weather words were our dagger in the fog." His phrasing captured the essence, a weapon invisible, sharp yet impossible to wield with certainty. As the smoke cleared at Pearl Harbor, Allied codebreakers realized that the couriers and their satchels had been distractions. The true signals of war had arrived not in safes or trunks, but in whispers of weather. And yet the Allies were already turning those whispers into keys. By 1942, entire teams at Bletchley and Arlington Hall would devote themselves to stripping Japanese naval codes bare, line by line, syllable by syllable, often starting with the most ordinary of forecasts. Pearl Harbor, December 8, 1941. Smoke still curled from the twisted hulks of the Arizona and the Oklahoma when the first intelligence cables crossed Washington. The east wind signal, whether heard or not, had become prophecy fulfilled. War had arrived, and with it came a new urgency. If weather words could herald catastrophe, what else could be hidden inside Japanese transmissions? At Arlington Hall, the Signal Intelligence Service expanded overnight. A War Department memo dated December 10th recorded that all available linguists and clerks are to be reassigned to Pacific intercept work, effective immediately. The numbers swelled. By January 1942, more than 400 personnel were listening, logging and collating Japanese broadcasts, compared with just a few dozen before the attack. The scale was industrial, a factory of silence and scribbles where the raw material was static and the output was fragments of order. Retention hook. Consider the contrast. In downtown Washington, shop windows still displayed Christmas wreaths, radios hummed with Bing Crosby, and children wrote letters to Santa. Inside Arlington Hall, the staff worked 12-hour shifts, fueled by coffee and sandwiches, passing fragments of code that could reveal the location of a battleship. Holiday cheer on one side of the city, the hunt for shadows on the other. Bletchley Park, too, shifted its priorities. By February 1942, intercept teams were dedicating entire boards to charting weather-related traffic. A memo from Hut 7 noted, "Repetition of meteorological phraseology remains our most useful crib for naval code groups." That dry language concealed a revelation. The weather words had not only signaled war, they were opening the door to breaking Japan's most trusted ciphers. Japanese couriers still moved across neutral Europe, bags chained to their wrists, but their world was collapsing. On January 20th, 1942, Portuguese port records at Lisbon noted the arrival of a Tokyo courier ship carrying sealed trunks. Yet Allied surveillance, sharpened by the east wind panic, now photographed the couriers as they stepped ashore, their movements logged in OSS Europe branch files. They were no longer ghosts. They were Quarry, a guard at Bletchley, later recalled in a brief memoir. Every page of intercepted chatter felt heavier after Pearl Harbor, as if words themselves carried shrapnel. That line captures the emotional shift. The war had made code-breaking more than academic. It was survival. The Japanese, however, remained convinced their rituals were intact. In January 1942, a consular directive ordered that couriers will redouble vigilance. Safes will be inspected at shift change. They tightened the locks, not realizing the real breach was invisible. Drifting over shortwave bands, retention hook, what was more dangerous, a locked bag chained to a courier's wrist, or a weather phrase repeated on Radio Tokyo. The Allies already knew the answer. In the first weeks of 1942, fragments of weather traffic helped correlate fleet movements near the Marshall Islands. A note from the U.S. Navy's OP-20G unit logged, "Forecast correlates with IJN activity east of Kwajalein, February 1, 1942. That correlation helped guide the first American carrier raids in the Pacific, thus the east wind panic transformed into policy. No longer were weather words dismissed as chatter. They were treated as levers, pry bars against the steel vault of Japanese secrecy. The irony was complete. The empire that guarded its couriers with white gloves and revolvers had betrayed itself with the casual voice of a weatherman. By the spring of 1942, Japan's secrecy apparatus stood at a crossroads. Hardliners in Tokyo insisted that the empire's codebooks, chained couriers, and wax-sealed satchels were impenetrable. Moderates quietly worried that the very patterns of their communications had become predictable, even dangerous. Inside Japan's foreign ministry, a heated directive circulated in April. No forecast should be repeated in plain language if avoidable. But the radio men, pressured by routine and bound by their meteorological duty, continued their broadcasts with the same cadence. At Bletchley Park, the contrast was electric. Intercept rooms filled with fresh recruits, many of them women recruited from universities, their hands quick with typewriters and their ears trained on static. One operator later remembered in a 1947 interview, "We measured time by the rhythm of Tokyo's rain." These young women became indispensable, their work transforming scraps of meteorology into the scaffolding for major decryption. The shift was cultural as well as technical. In wartime Britain, women who had once been expected to teach or serve in canteens now wielded the tools of cryptanalysis, their contributions decisive yet invisible to the public. Retention hook. Think of the paradox here. Japan tightened its satchels with double locks, while British clerks unlocked its navy using a word as small as rain. How could a global empire be betrayed by something so ordinary? The Americans, too, pressed their advantage. At Arlington Hall, intercept logs from May 1942 show side-by-side comparisons of weather reports and naval signals. Analysts noticed that certain meteorological codes preceded fleet movements by days. One log entry on May 21 noted, "Report of high pressure east of Honshu coincided with IJN sortie from Yokosuka." The correlation was undeniable. Forecasts were not just forecasts, they were echoes of strategy. Meanwhile, in prisoner of war camps across the United States, captured Japanese sailors whispered among themselves about the disasters unfolding in the Pacific. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, a guard reported overhearing one officer mutter, "Our codes they think are stone. But even stone cracks in rain." That remark, entered into a camp intelligence report in June 1942, revealed the creeping doubt even among the captured. The Japanese Foreign Ministry responded with more rules. Couriers were ordered to carry self-igniting pouches lined with magnesium, capable of destroying codebooks in seconds. Consular staff in Berlin and Lisbon were drilled to burn their satchels at the first hint of seizure. And yet the Allies knew the truth. Destruction on land could not erase the words already carried by radio across oceans. The split inside Japan deepened. Hardliners clung to ritual, the white gloves, the red wax, the sense of inviolability. Moderates began experimenting with new additive ciphers, but implementation lagged. By the time changes reached the fleet, The Allies had already adapted. A June 1942 memo from OP-20G bluntly assessed, "The weather key remains exploitable. Repetition unchanged despite directives." Retention hook. In this struggle of ink and air, who held the real advantage? The men with revolvers guarding satchels on docks, or the women in headsets in a damp hut in Buckinghamshire? The answer was becoming clear. The Allies, by embracing invisibility, had gained leverage over an empire obsessed with visible ritual. A Japanese officer's memoir, written years later, admitted, "We trusted leather and lock more than logic." That line, brief but damning, captured the empire's blind spot. For all their vigilance, the Japanese had overlooked the simplest truth of modern war. Words could travel faster, farther and more faithfully than any courier on a train. By mid-1942, the Allies were no longer simply listening for weather. They were exploiting it as a daily tool, a running start into every intercepted naval cipher. And the Japanese, trapped in their own cycle of secrecy, could not yet see that the fortress was already compromised. Lisbon, March 1943. In a smoky cafe near the waterfront, Allied surveillance officers watched as two Japanese couriers adjusted their cuffs and ordered black coffee. On the table between them sat the ever-present leather satchels, seals unbroken, locks polished to a dull gleam. They had crossed a war-torn continent under the flag of diplomatic immunity, relying on the 1929 Geneva and Red Cross conventions that forbade interference with official pouches. A British case officer's report, filed under OSS Europe branch, noted dryly, "Couriers move with an air of untouchability, yet are predictable in habit and route." But by 1943, the faith in satchels was cracking. Allied naval patrols had already seized several Japanese ships carrying diplomatic cargo. In one infamous case, the Awamaru, intercepted off Taiwan in 1944, panic forced Japanese officers to ignite self-destruct pouches lined with magnesium. Flames consumed codebooks in seconds, leaving only ash and a faint odor of sulfur. That invention itself was a symptom of fear. If the bags were so inviolable, why did Tokyo feel the need to make them burn at a touch? Retention hook. Consider the paradox. A pouch chained to a courier's wrist could resist theft, yet a single spark could undo years of secrecy in an instant. Which was more dangerous to Japan, an enemy hand or its own fire? The International Red Cross, based in Geneva, found itself drawn unwillingly into the drama. In an inspection note from April 1943, Red Cross official Karl Burkhardt lamented that the abuse of diplomatic pouches threatens the integrity of all protections. To the neutral humanitarian, the satchels symbolized more than secrecy. They risked corroding the fragile trust that allowed aid to cross front lines. Meanwhile, in America, the tide of intelligence work shifted from interception to education. Arlington Hall had grown to more than 1,200 staff by the summer of 1943, an intelligence city within a city. Here, young recruits learned not only ciphers, but also Japanese history, naval structure, even weather patterns. A War Department training bulletin from July 1943 recorded that language and culture instruction, now mandatory for all intercept analysts. It was an acknowledgement that words alone were not enough. They needed context, understanding, the ability to see how ritual concealed vulnerability. And in the POW camps of the American Midwest, the first experiments in re-education began. At Camp Hearne in Texas, guards distributed English-language newspapers like the Chicago Tribune to captured officers. Reports noted that prisoners were startled by how openly Americans criticized Roosevelt and even questioned the war effort in editorials. One German POW remarked in astonishment, "Your papers speak against your leaders." Yet the guards remained calm. That moment of contrast, a censored empire versus a free press, was itself a tool of war. A silent education. The Japanese, by comparison, doubled down. Orders to consular staff demanded routine inspection of safes, triple copies of codebooks, and strict destruction drills. But these measures could not hide the truth from those who watched. OSS officers in Lisbon followed couriers not for their contents but for their patterns. Which hotel they chose, which café they favored, which train they caught on Tuesdays. Predictability was betrayal, and the satchels had become beacons rather than shields. Retention hook. Could it be that the more fiercely Japan clutched its satchels, the more visible they became? Allied observers thought so. And with each passing month, as weather intercepts accumulated and couriers were shadowed, the fortress of secrecy looked less like a fortress and more like a paper lantern, bright, ritualistic but fragile in the wind. By the end of 1943, Allied intelligence no longer feared the bags. They feared only the silence between broadcasts, the moments when even the weathermen went quiet. For in that silence they knew Japan was preparing its next move. Tokyo, November 1943. Inside the Foreign Ministry, the sound of paper shredders and the smell of singed documents filled the corridors. Couriers, once symbols of unshakable trust, now lived under suspicion. Orders circulated weekly. Rehearse the burning of satchels, inspect the seals twice per shift, verify the safe locks before dawn and dusk. Yet every new instruction revealed the truth, that confidence in the system was crumbling. A junior clerk wrote in a diary later discovered in post-war archives, "We trust only the flame. Paper cannot be trusted to travel anymore." Across the Pacific, the Allies sensed the psychological shift. At Arlington Hall, intercept logs in December 1943 showed not only the familiar weather cribs, but also new irregularities, slight hesitations in Japanese phrasing, rushed broadcasts, missing segments. Analysts noted these gaps as evidence of fear, as if even the weathermen no longer trusted their own words. A report filed January 1944 concluded, "Increased inconsistency of broadcast format suggests internal breakdown of discipline. Retention hook. What happens when an empire begins to doubt its own rituals?" The leather satchel, once carried like a relic, now felt like a liability. The very symbol of inviolability had become a burden strapped to the wrist. Meanwhile, in the United States, re-education programs expanded rapidly. At Camp McCoy and Camp Hearne, Japanese prisoners were offered English classes, vocational training and exposure to American life. Army records show that by mid-1944, more than 1,600 Japanese POWs were enrolled in structured courses across multiple camps. Classrooms taught not only language but also civics, how newspapers published criticism of governors, how elections were contested openly. For many prisoners, the shock was profound. One recalled decades later, "We learned that a leader could be questioned, and the guards would smile." Numbers told the larger story. A U.S. Civil Affairs report filed in March 1944 counted 3,200 POWs participating in organized cultural programs, from libraries stocked with American novels to church services offered in both English and Japanese. These were small things, but they chipped away at the idea of a monolithic, censored empire. The contrast was unmistakable. While Tokyo tightened its grip on couriers, the Allies loosened their grip on information, using abundance and openness as weapons. In Europe, OSS agents watching couriers in Lisbon noted a new paranoia. A surveillance log from February 1944 recorded, "Courier sat 3 hours in hotel lobby, touching satchel repeatedly, as if expecting seizure." The rituals of confidence had become tics of fear. The more visibly the Japanese clutched their secrets, the more obvious their weakness became. Retention hook. Could a satchel carried with white gloves inspire respect, or did it now betray fragility? To Allied eyes, every nervous gesture confirmed what the intercepts already revealed. The system was breaking under its own weight. By the summer of 1944, even neutral observers noticed. An International Red Cross inspector visiting Tokyo in July, a Swiss national named Hans Bachmann, noted discreetly in his diary that couriers appear weary, their trust in secrecy diminished. They speak more of fire than of locks. His observation, later quoted in occupation reports, was a rare outside glimpse into the psychological unraveling inside the Japanese bureaucracy. The Allies, by contrast, had turned interception into certainty. They no longer waited anxiously for the east wind rain signal. They expected cracks, they exploited them daily, and they taught their POWs to recognize the irony, that truth traveled more freely in enemy camps than in the courier's own ministries. By the time 1944 closed, the Japanese courier system was not abolished, but it had lost its aura. It persisted only as a habit, a ritual without faith. And for the Allies, That loss of faith was as valuable as any codebook seized from the fire. Manila Bay, February 1945. Smoke from naval bombardment rolled across the harbor as American forces closed in on the shattered Japanese garrison. Yet even amid the ruins, the ritual persisted. 2 surviving couriers, their uniforms scorched and their satchels chained to their wrists, attempted to flee by truck toward the interior. They carried nothing but scraps, half-burned codebooks and the metallic smell of magnesium from failed self-destruct kits. An American patrol report dated February 27, 1945, described the capture. The pouches yielded only ashes. Couriers seemed resigned, repeating that the fire had saved their secrets, but had it? Allied decrypts from Arlington Hall and Bletchley Park by this stage had already rendered the Japanese systems porous. The famed JN-25 naval code lay in tatters. The weather broadcasts that once guided fleets were predictable to the hour. A Navy intelligence officer noted bluntly in March 1945, "Couriers have become ceremonial only, strategic traffic already ours." The satchel, once the iron seal of Tokyo's foreign ministry, had been reduced to a relic carried for dignity, not security. Retention hook. How strange that at the empire's height, a leather bag could terrify Washington, but by its collapse, that same bag was no more threatening than a burned envelope. What changed was not the leather or the lock, it was faith itself. On the American side, faith was invested in planning the world to come. As early as January 1945, the War Department had begun compiling figures for post-war repatriation. Internal memoranda show projections of 132,000 Japanese POWs to be processed, transported, and eventually returned home. The task was not only logistical but psychological. How to return men who had seen America's abundance, free press and education, and who might carry those impressions back into a devastated homeland. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, records from April 1945 noted that 480 Japanese POWs were attending weekly vocational courses in carpentry, agriculture, and machine repair. The numbers mattered because they spoke to a deliberate policy: turn captives into carriers of a new vision, a kind of counter-courier system. Instead of leather satchels filled with codes, the Allies prepared human messengers filled with ideas of democracy, open society, and technical skill. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, paranoia deepened. Foreign Ministry directives of May 1945 ordered couriers to double-wrap documents, to carry small vials of acid for emergency destruction, and to memorize entire cables in case paper could not survive. But no matter the ritual, the outcome was the same: silence, fire, and futility. OSS agents monitoring diplomatic routes in neutral Sweden observed couriers who no longer carried real intelligence, but only ceremonial letters of introduction. The satchel was now a mask, not a weapon. Retention hook. What if the last thing carried across a continent under the banner of secrecy was not a war plan, but a blank page meant only to preserve appearances? By 1945, many couriers bore precisely that burden, a theater of confidence performed for a collapsing empire. The irony was stark. In New York, newspapers like the New York Times openly debated how many billions should be set aside for the Marshall Plan, an idea still nascent, yet already public. In Tokyo, by contrast, even trivial weather notes were guarded as if they were jewels. The contrast between openness and suffocation could not have been greater. As spring turned to summer, the last true act of the Japanese courier system was not transmission, but disappearance. Satchels were burned in palace courtyards, in consular basements, and on the decks of retreating ships. A post-war Allied survey later counted more than 270 documented pouch destructions between 1944 and 1945, each leaving behind little more than ash and the acrid smell of chemicals. By then, the world had moved on. The question was no longer whether the satchel could protect secrets, but whether those who once carried it could adapt to a world where secrets mattered less than trust. Yokohama Harbor, October 1945. The docks groaned under the weight of returned ships, Liberty vessels reconfigured to carry men instead of munitions. Japanese POWs, once captured in the deserts of New Guinea or the jungles of Burma, now filed up gangplanks in orderly columns. In their hands they carried no satchels, no locked leather bags, only bedrolls, Red Cross parcels, and in some cases, English textbooks from the camps. An Allied Repatriation Office report logged 132,000 Japanese prisoners returned by the end of 1946, a monumental flow of men back into a shattered homeland. The symbolism was not lost on observers. The Empire's couriers had once crossed oceans to guard secrets, chained to satchels that could vanish into fire. Now those who had seen America's farms, factories, and free press carried something far more dangerous to the old order: memory. Camp Hearne had released men who had debated politics freely for the first time. Camp McCoy had trained hundreds in trades that would be vital to rebuilding villages and ports. A War Department survey in 1946 recorded over 3,500 Japanese POWs who had received vocational certificates while in captivity. These were the new couriers, bearing skills and impressions instead of codes. Retention hook. Could the faint image of a Chicago newspaper clipping, folded into a POW's pocket, have more power in post-war Japan than all the ashes of Tokyo's burned satchels? Even the figures told a quiet revolution. By 1947, more than 12,000 former POWs had enrolled in re-education or civic training programs under Allied supervision. Some joined Japan's new local councils. Others became teachers or clerks. The U.S. Information Service tracked their progress, noting with cautious optimism that exposure to democratic institutions in captivity appears to have lasting effect. It was statistical proof that education had succeeded, where leather and lock had failed. Meanwhile, Europe and America turned from war to reconstruction. The Marshall Plan, announced in June 1947, pledged billions in aid, openly debated in newspapers from Boston to Berlin. The free press, once a curiosity to Japanese prisoners, was now the engine driving transparency in recovery. The contrast could not have been sharper. Japan's couriers had fought to keep weather reports secret, while American senators argued the future of entire continents in public session. At the same time, women who had taken up wartime roles in factories, in the Women's Army Corps, in aviation ferrying, remained visible reminders that societies could adapt, expand, and democratize under pressure. Many Japanese POWs had seen women operating machinery or delivering rations in camps, a striking contrast to their expectations from home. For some, it was the first glimpse of a social order in which roles could shift without collapse. Retention hook. What had more impact on a returning soldier, a burned codebook, or the memory of a female mechanic in Texas handing him a tin plate of beans with quiet confidence? Such moments lingered far longer than Tokyo's rituals of secrecy. By 1948, Japan was no longer guarded by satchels, but by treaties, councils, and emerging alliances. The old courier system had vanished, leaving only faint traces in OSS archives and the ashes swept from consular courtyards. In its place rose a new kind of courier, students carrying re-education booklets, workers trained in American agricultural techniques, officials tasked with shaping a democracy under Allied oversight. The cinematic irony is inescapable. A single weather word, once hidden in a pouch and whispered across the Pacific, had brought fleets into battle and empires to ruin. Yet in the end, it was not fire or secrecy that shaped the future. It was openness, memory, and the transmission of ideas. The last image is of a ship departing San Francisco in 1946. On its manifest are hundreds of Japanese prisoners, now repatriates, their satchels replaced by parcels stamped with the emblem of the Red Cross. Among them, one man carries a small notebook given by an American teacher. Its first page marked with a phrase in English, "Freedom begins with words." And so the war of satchels ended not with a lock clicking shut, but with a message carried forward into Reconstruction, into the Marshall Plan, into the alliances that still define our world,